Kim Bohr is the president and chief operating officer at Spark Effect, where she leads the firm in helping executive teams navigate disruption without fracturing trust. With over 25 years of cross-functional leadership experience, Kim advises leaders on aligning strategy with human-centered practices that drive performance. Her approach centers around Spark Effect trust elasticity, a well-researched framework designed to evaluate and fortify trust during periods of change, whether it be AI integration, leadership turnover, or restructuring. Really excited to dive into disruption and trust and some of the things we're all probably going through now. So, Kim, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. I'm excited to be here with you.
Same here. Well, Kim, the first question that always comes is from all of your experience, what do you believe is the one most important characteristic of a great leadership team?
I think it's when there's true alignment and communication. That is so critical. And in the work I do and what we've done through Spark Effect, that is always the biggest breakdown.
Yeah, interesting. And when I just started working with a brand new client 2 days ago, and one of the things I hear when I work with a new client, and when I say client, it's a senior leadership team, is almost always one of the first problems is, we don't have enough alignment. We need more alignment.
Right.
So that word comes up over and over again. And very often it starts with a level of trust in what the direction is and the strategy moving forward, which aligns very well with
Very
what I
much
know we're
so.
going to be diving into.
Yeah, and that's a big piece of it, right? The communication alignment really becomes these underlying components of that overarching topic of trust. And it seems simple and it seems squishy. And what we'll talk about is it's really not. It's got a lot more depth to it than people give it.
Yeah, and by the way, it's easy to spend a day or two together as a team and come up with plans for the year and the quarter and where do we want to be 3 years from now, all things that I do with my clients. But what they don't get very often is the easy part is doing that and leaving the meeting, holding hands, singing Kumbaya, we're all aligned. Yeah. And what they actually understand later is that's not the hard part. The hard part is every day after that. Is staying aligned.
The consistency, right? That part that feels when you hit especially when you come across some of the resistance, if you will, in its various forms.
So we're going to dive into disruption. As painful as that sounds, we're going to dive into disruption. And obviously we could probably list out 37 types of disruption, but what are you seeing right now when you're out there working with your clients and speaking? What are the most common types of disruption leaders are seeing these days?
I think it's several things. There's the personal disruptions that I think we cannot ignore, which are the things like childcare and elder care challenges and, things that force when return to work policies come into play. And it's really, what do we do in these situations? Health concerns. The other side that we've seen a tremendous amount too is the outplacement side of our business is, unfortunately quite busy right now in that way. There's a lot of layoffs happening, a lot of reduction in force because of some of the challenges. So that disruption is around, leadership turnover, realignment in the strategy and goals. And some of that is at, the company level and some of it's at the personal level. And we can't separate them. And so those are really in our face right now in every organization that we're working with.
I want to key on one example, and I think you alluded to part of it when you talk about outplacement, because this does impact outplacement to a degree, but it's a bigger impact than that. And the disruption I want to dive into just as an example for the moment is AI.
Yeah.
And that disruption and how trust factors into that. And let me be more specific about what I'm seeing. And I'd love to frankly, get your coaching and how somebody like me should be dealing with my clients on this is, there are whatever side of the fence you are, whatever you think about AI, whether it's the second coming and some amazing thing, or whether it's death to society and Terminator and Skynet, wherever you are there, I don't think anyone would argue that there is some incredible things happening today with AI that allow leaders and companies and individuals to be, more efficient at what they're doing, to some degree more effective. The value is there. And the challenge that a lot of my leaders and leadership teams are having is when implementing these AI tools, or more likely, AI is not typically something that gets implemented from the top
Yeah.
down like an ERP system. It's a little bit more grassroots. So rather than me saying when implementing, when encouraging teams to begin using AI tools, and there are even some firms out there, there's a consulting firm recently that I heard, if you're not what they call AI native, which means you're ready and able to use
Mhm.
AI from day one, they're not hiring you.
Wow.
And, that is terrifying. A whole lot of people that say, wait a minute, I get you want to implement AI, but I know that's code for we're going to use AI instead of employees, like Amazon using robots instead of
Yeah.
people. So all this means is, I may lose my job because of this one day. So how do you deal with that fear, and how could we use trust and better leadership to manage that kind of disruption?
Well, let me answer your question in a couple of ways. So one is when we set out, we had this curiosity because AI was in our face for all of us. It was coming at us even in our organization around how do we start to think about it for how we do our business. And we got really curious because we were hearing these anecdotal comments from clients around trust and AI, right? The two were just kind of floating out there. What it prompted us to do was do this research around the state of organizational trust with this idea of disruption in AI originally as a leading factor. And then what we started to think about as we structured the survey was that no, it's more than that. That's a component of it, but it's all these other things. What we found in the research was that AI is by far the most disruptive, but it's not the biggest breaker of trust. And that was really fascinating to us. And so, what we were realizing as we started to unpack the data was that the biggest trust destroyers were really behind, the yes, poor system or AI technology implementations absolutely is there, but it was really about the intentionality around it and the communication or lack thereof and bringing people along in the process was really what was breaking it down. And so with AI being as all at the complete ends of the spectrum for all of us around whether organizations are very intentional and organized in it or if it's a Wild West, there's underlying components really make the difference around how people are feeling about it, how they're using it, whether they feel like their jobs are being taken. And so what we know that if we can be more precise in how we think about why we're bringing this in and how we're communicating and how it fits into the bigger strategy and how people align, there's a better opportunity for that trust to be, to be maintained or to be built versus if it's just a Wild West. Because what I know from our experience, and I'm sure the teams you're working with, is if people don't have to do it, they're not going to necessarily dive in. You're going to have that spectrum of people who are all in, and then the people who are like, yeah, okay, I'm just going to fly under the radar here because there's not really clear why I need to do this.
Yeah, I love what you said about intentionality and communication. And, I was reading through the Trust and Turbulence
Yeah.
2025 State of Organizational Trust. In reading through that, one thing that I think gets to the intentionality and the communication that was really interesting, and I loved it because it's a way to sell an idea that I know is
Yeah.
important in organizations around getting clear on strategy is, and I wrote this down, so I'm going to read it, that 93% of high trust respondents say their organization has a clear strategy.
Yes.
Only 40% of low trust respondents say their organization had a clear
Yep.
strategy, but
Exactly.
93% of high trust. So I don't think organizations, leadership teams normally equate, like if they don't have a clear strategy, they certainly know that's going to impact their business results. But I
Mhm.
don't know that leaders, and I never have really equated, hey, if we have a clear business strategy that's communicated, our people are going to trust us more. So unpack
Yeah.
that a little bit because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah. So one of the things that we found as just some tremendous results that came out of this survey, was that trust actually can be measured, and it can be measured and it should be included as part of a business strategy. What we found was that, as that number you just shared, it absolutely impacts retention, revenue, and reputation. And we have the stats to show it. And so what we were finding was that, organizations, when there's disruption, the reality is we're all in micro disruptions, right? Like we talked about, all of a sudden something happens where our kids, the shifting of childcare, whatever that case may be. So micro disruptions are happening all the time. Most organizations are just they're mitigating risk against the larger disruptions. And what we found was that for those that considered themselves to be within high trust organizations, they felt like there was more transparency and communication around why we're making changes and what things are happening versus those low trust organizations. I mean, that's really important to have your leaders and your employees directly, the individual contributors, being able to say, I can tell the difference because of how my organization communicates with me, sets me up for success. So some of the things that we found in part of that high trust were things like understanding the different trade-offs, right? Like why are we making these trade-offs as an organization? Looking at the perceived misalignment, right? So, or excuse me, the alignment. So like, why is this working in my organization? Why does this matter to what I'm doing? Opportunities to voice concern. So like being able to say, I don't see this as a fit, and not having fear of retribution. So those are really critical elements that I think what tends to happen is we have this understanding of how trust is important. What we are missing in many organizations and leaders is that the actions we're taking on just this day-to-day basis actually aren't supporting that knowledge of trust being important, and we're taking it for granted. And we're kind of hurting ourselves by these actions that we're just not paying attention to.
So I want to get back and dive into some of the actions, but there's something I want
Yeah.
to cover first. I love having measures for
Mhm.
quote unquote softer things. And I hate that
Yes.
term. The softer stuff is really the harder stuff. So I don't
It
like that
certainly is.
term, but I love having, there's this cliche we all know, you can't manage what you don't measure. And it's a cliche because it's mostly true. So
Yeah.
you've got this trust performance index. And when I
Yes.
hear something like that, I salivate like, oh, we could measure something like that. And you just kind of mentioned that. Tell me more about the trust performance index. How actually is that measured?
Yeah. So what we were able to do is we based it off of 5 key domains, of which then statements associated with each domain are built underneath. And so the 5 domains I can share are: it's strategic clarity, psychological safety, relational continuity, and cultural belonging. The feeling of technology and system trust, so that how things are being implemented we're being considered in that. And then the final one is really the fairness, change, and impact perception. So those 5 are things that we know to be true, but we were able to actually use those and the statements beneath it to actually then figure out that this could be measured, and not just measured, it could be replicated and built into organization's way of doing business, just like you measure other KPIs in your business. And what was surprising to us is that this hasn't been looked at in the same way so broadly before. And it feels like it's a low-hanging fruit for companies to do that can actually increase that revenue and retention and reputation without a whole lot of dollars invested. It's really just about thinking about how we look at it differently and making those connecting points.
So you've got the 5 dimensions, and what I'm imagining, and tell me if I'm picturing this right. You got these 5 dimensions, and below each one, I guess there's a certain number of best practice statements or questions, and the organization is answering those. And from there, you're
Yeah.
coming up with your trust performance index.
Yeah. So individuals would answer them inside the organization, all the way, all throughout the organization, regardless of your role. And you would answer things like organizational leaders follow through on their commitments they make. And then they would answer, that on the range. They would say, new technologies are introduced with employee success in mind. So there's several of those statements that they're answering. And what we were finding is we then have, it really created what we call these elasticity scores. So you could see the sense of how far can an organization kind of bend without breaking. And we were able to find that low trust organizations versus high trust organizations had quite a big difference in that scoring. What was also very interesting in this study we did was what we had to get the baseline around disruption. We asked people kind of a select all that applied between the personal and professional disruptions that we listed. 71% of people had a disruption in the last 2 years. What was interesting is that there became a control group of people who felt like they hadn't had. They did not identify with those things as disruptive. And so that became an interesting component that then started to tell us about how companies should be thinking about mitigating risk versus leaning in.
You also did some work, and you alluded to it a few minutes ago, in, that there's a real ROI of building this
Really, very
trust.
much
This
so.
isn't just soft, squishy. Wouldn't it be nice if you and
Yeah.
your people had a trusting relationship? Talk a little bit about what that ROI is.
Yeah. So just in this study alone, we were able to quantify, and you started to talk a bit about it too when you talked about the clear strategy, right? We found that those who responded that felt they were a part of this high trust organization found things like the financial performance, the higher confidence in the company's financial performance. High trust organizations had 97% in that response. Low trust responders were at 46%. I mean, we're talking about some pretty big gaps. When it came to looking at industry reputation, high trust was at 97%, and we had low trust at 49%. And the same kind of pattern was true with retention. So you think about in highly competitive times, when we're trying to think about how do we, secure and invest in the best talent, so much of it can be done in just some of these best practices of how we think about rolling out disruptive technology like AI. It's not that we aren't going to do it, but it is about how do we bring people along to understand where they fit and how it's going to help benefit them and the organization.
So let's dive into some of the actions, some of the best
Yeah.
practices. And I want to talk about two different things. I'm going to start with the positive, and then we're going to go to the negative. The
Yeah.
positive is, when disruption hits, whether it's someone's personal disruption or whether
Hmm.
it's organizational disruption, whether it's COVID or it's tariffs or it's AI or whatever it is, when those types of disruptions hit, what specific leader behaviors will most reliably build trust? And then I want to talk about
Yeah.
which ones erode trust, but let's talk about what builds trust.
Yeah. So let me answer that on kind of two levels. So one of the things that we knew just from the kind of higher level ends of the research were things like the open and honest communication and transparency around like what we know, what we don't know, when we're going to let you know next. The, fair treatment and empathy towards employees, voicing concerns, as we mentioned before, and really just this visible alignment between what we said we want to do and where we're going. More specifically, there's a lot of things leaders can do to build trust on any given day for their teams. The simple things of understanding what's going on and why somebody might now suddenly be showing up late when they never were showing up late, historically, to things like really trying to figure out how are we doing on a week to week basis? How do I take what's happening from the executive level and translate it into what it means from our team? So I don't sound like I'm just parroting the corporate speak, because that is a clear, trust buster right there. So there's a lot of, we called them the frontline or local level leader, wherever that is in the hierarchy of an organization. And why that's so important is because that's where trust breaks the most. And so having those types of activities for leaders to do is really important, on any given day.
I have found that, and I want you to weigh in on this. One of the things that I find most leaders either don't do or don't do well is the regular, and I think it should be weekly, but at least a regular one-on-one meeting with each of their
Mhm.
direct reports. And when I say don't do or don't do well, obviously don't do is some of them just say, I have no time for that. We have team meetings, when they need me, they'll knock on my
Mhm.
door or they'll call me or we'll have a Teams meeting, but I don't need a regular one-on-one. And others, their regular one-on-one is let's get together for 30 minutes so I can just make sure you're doing all the things you said you were going to do. And that's
Yeah.
the extent of it. How does that factor in? And do you believe
Yep.
that regular one-on-one is an important part of building trust and building a relationship?
Yeah, I think it's a critical piece. And one of the things that we find, as I'm sure you do, is that there is not one way it is done consistently inside an organization. And I think that is very common for leaders to be like, oh, of all the things I need to push, I'm going to push this particular thing. And that's a big mistake. So much of the rapport building and understanding what's going on with somebody, even personally, is happening in those types of settings, really getting to understand. So that is so critical. And I think the other mistake, as you were saying, that leaders do is that they make it about an agenda of theirs, not the agenda of the individual whose one on one it really should be. And yeah, there's a balance of shaping to make sure we're talking about the right things, but sometimes our agenda maybe doesn't actually uncover what's really going on. And when that 30 minutes is up and we're like, okay, sorry to move on, that person may just continue to hold on to what maybe is the most important thing. And it could be something really critical to a project or to something that they're responsible for. And so not feeling that sense of you don't, there's a sense of you don't really care. And if you don't care, well, why should I? Can start to happen very quickly. And that really will absolutely erode trust really quick.
How do we help leaders who understand this logically, but say, my God, I have so many things to do
Mhm.
every day, and I've got so many projects and priorities I'm accountable for, and KPIs that I'm accountable for. I could barely get through the day and just getting all my work done. And now you want me to take extra time and effort to be having one-on-ones with my people and building trust with my team and making sure, they understand the strategy and, all things that I don't think most leaders would understand there's a logical things to do, but so many just say that would be great if I had all the time in the world. I just don't have time for that soft, squishy
Yeah.
stuff. How do we help them figure out how to do more of this and maybe even why they should do more of this?
Yeah. Well, I think in at least our US business culture, it feels like we're just constantly sprinting through whatever it is. And it doesn't feel like there's a lot of breaks. And I think that what you describe is a really common, short term issue that so many leaders have. And it's really about trying to help them shift to that longer term impact, like what happens down the line, not just what's happening in front of us. Because we all know that in that the decisions we make in the short term, like as simple as it sounds to cancel one-on-one, but not structure them in a way that really gets to the heart of what's going on with this person in the business will absolutely eventually come back and bite us. And thinking about this research, we really wanted it to be really uncover hard data, and it did, but that leaders could see like that this is why you're kind of playing a long game. And it's thinking about it from you could do things today that immediately start to build that trust. And then you start to think about the impact it can look at down the line and that you can measure it and you could say, hey, how are we thinking about this and how is it working? So trying to say that, this has a direct connection to those, key KPIs that we're all tracking and trying to get people to realize that this little bit more of investment up front starts to pay dividends down the line, but it requires us to deal with that internal pull we sometimes have when we're just in such a reactive mode.
What are some of the behaviors that leaders make a habit of? What are those leadership behaviors that maybe we're blind to and we don't realize they're eroding trust? but they
Mhm.
are eroding trust. What are some of those behaviors that really hurt trust rather than help trust?
Oh my goodness. So I think, lack of transparency and clarity around, why we're doing this versus just saying, hey, we're just doing this. And it's like, it feels like it catches people off guard. Perceived misalignment. Like you said, we were on this track and now this feels very much like we're over here. Why, so again, not bringing people along. So that misalignment and not feeling like having people feel like their needs are being met. And like you alluded to this with this AI, phenomenon we're in, poor handling of why we're focused on it, poor handling of systems and technology rollout. So why do I need to do this? Am I going to be training this thing to take my job? That's a common, fight or flight sentiment people have. And so we need to recognize that we need to help them feel that what they're doing is, does have purpose, that that this is to help them and, to build the trust. If we are in a situation where there is going to be elimination, then I think that transparency about what the trajectory is and why the pivot of the business has to happen also has to come forward. And I think, I was working with an executive team and the CEO in particular really had a very strong belief that he really couldn't let other members on the executive team know what was happening, especially if there needed to be some turnover until it happened. And he was communicating out to the ELT at the same time the larger population knew a change was happening. And he really struggled with changing that belief system because of course it eroded trust. The ELT team didn't have a heads up to know, well, what do we have to pivot and pick up, and are these the right pieces? And so that was a really fast way to have that team, amongst other things that were happening, but to have them just believe, like, why are we here? What's our purpose if you're not here and you don't see us as the trust partners to help when these kind of big decisions have to be made?
Yeah, it's an interesting scenario in that, as leaders, we want our team members to trust us. And of
Mhm.
course, we believe we're trustworthy and they should
Yeah.
trust us. But to your point, at the same time, there's very often a whole lot of information that we don't trust our teams enough to communicate. And sometimes it may not even be about a disruption. I have worked with leadership teams where, private company and the CEO doesn't even share profitability numbers.
Mhm.
They'll share top line revenue numbers, but they don't share profitability numbers even with their senior leadership team. Because the fear is if they know what our profitability is, number one, then they could figure out how much money I'm putting in my pocket as CEO and owner. Number two, if I tell them what's to stop that getting out to our competition.
Yeah.
And that's just and yet that same founder CEO expects the team to trust him or her.
Right. Yeah, and it doesn't I think part of that too starts to shift around what kind of business are we trying to have, right? And when we think about founder, type of led businesses that are private businesses that are maybe more of the not trying to grow, not trying to, to just more lifestyle businesses, I think that there's a lot of conflict there, inside those teams and what we're trying to accomplish and why we're going in the direction we're going. And so I think really trying to be that I think that's an unfortunate common mistake that happens that really then starts to just, yeah, completely erode trust. And really just starts to then impact the whole nature of the business and the mission the business is trying to accomplish.
And if you do this right, you talk also in the study about something you call the disruption dividend.
Yes.
And the idea that if you do this right, a disruption it could wind up being a very positive thing. Unpack that a little bit.
Yeah. So what was really interesting to us is because we had that control group, we were able to look at, organizations that responded. It didn't have to be, by the way, the response didn't have to be perfect. It was in good faith that you tried to, do the right things like that were on those trust builder lists. And what we found was that there was a growth of 12% above the baseline from organizations that had no disruption at all. So what that told us was you should really, perhaps mitigating risk isn't, there's more nuance to that. And the fact that the disruption is going to happen and it's happening all the time. And there's things like you described that are out of our control. So trying to really think about how we're going to respond authentically in these ways that the data was showing actually should encourage companies to lean in to the disruption and not be so fearful of it versus trying to completely mitigate it, because there's absolutely trust building that can happen.
So to help dive into some more specific actions that folks could take here. So when they're done listening, they can go, all right, I'm going to do these 2 or 3 things to build trust. Again, I'm going to use AI as an example because it's coming up so often with all of my clients every day. And I'm going to take kind of an extreme situation. So one of the industries that's getting hit really hard by AI is the marketing industry.
Yes.
Whether it's
very much
folks
so.
that used to do the copywriting and the copy editing, and now AI has taken some of that work away. Whether it is, we used to do search engine optimization, and now that's not as important as people are using the LLMs and getting recommendations from there, AI driven analysis. I mean, there's so many things impacting that industry. And let's make it real in that, you're a leader of a company and you are really driving hard to make sure the organization embraces AI. Part of it is, for survival of the company, because if you're doing things the way it was done 5 years ago, you're not going to survive anymore.
Yep.
And the reality of it is not just the all the positives that we want to communicate. The reality of it is, while yes, it's going to allow us to add more value to our clients, which is better for everyone. Yes, it's going to allow us to grow as a company, which ultimately provides more security for all of us. Brutal honesty is there are some people in the company today that may not be needed 3 months from now. So, and that's a real situation, and marketing may be an extreme version, but that's going on at law firms, marketing firms, and it's going on everywhere. As a leader, how should we be thinking about that? And what are 2 or 3 very specific actions that we can take to, build trust and help us move through that disruption without having, fear take over the organization?
I think that's such a real example so many organizations are facing now. And I think there's a few different items that are really important for consideration. So one is talking about where the company is going, really understanding the changes that need to be made, and then being able to communicate those in a way that talks about a path forward for those individuals that will be impacted. So maybe there is something internally. Maybe there's something where there's opportunity for some kind of job conversion, and maybe there's not. But if there is, it really is about thinking through that part of like, is there a way to have people either reskill internally or take those kind of skills in a different part of the organization and learn something new that isn't going to be the same kind of aspect of where AI is touching it. When organizations realize that's not or that's just not possible, or they've done that to the extent that they can, really being able to equip people with a career transition and outplacement type of service is really critical. Because what we're seeing right now is in that part of our business, organizations, as they start to realize what you just described, people need time to figure out, they need to go through the grief process, and they need to figure out, what am I doing next? And how do my skills need to transfer? And so working with somebody who's in as a career transition and outplacement coach, they can actually help them figure out how do they start to reskill, or how do aspects of what they have apply. That is something that maybe is not doable inside the organization, but needs to happen. And it's really tough for people to do on their own when they are suddenly, hit with this kind of news. And the reason I bring it up like that is to do that well and to equip people with the services that come with that, in such as what we do at Spark Effect, that is showing people fairness. It's bringing empathy into it. It's also showing people who aren't impacted that the organization is truly trying to do their best to get people to, so that their livelihoods aren't impacted negatively for very long, and that they have a way to move forward. And unfortunately, not a lot of organizations think about it that way. They think about something that feels more like a check the box, and is more just to be kind of a lipstick on the pig for the people that are there. Like, look, we tried something, but it's not really something that is going to actually be substantive and what's needed. And so I think thinking about it from that perspective, and then really trying to have people understand internally that, again, why are these decisions needing to be made for for the purpose of the clients and the organization, and that we recognize these are hard decisions when we have to impact individuals, and here's what we're doing to make sure they are set up for success.
Talk about your company, Spark Effect, a little bit.
Yeah.
Tell me more about the type of clients you work with and the different
Yeah.
ways you work with your clients.
So we have a range of services, also in much of that kind of mid-market to smaller enterprise space. What we do is we have executive coaching work we do that kind of comes in 3 different tiers. We have a readiness program that's very much around some of those kind of foundational communication, leading others, strategic thinking kind of work. We also do work with CEO evaluations. So we do work with CEOs and boards to help evaluate the CEO beyond just the KPIs, but it does bring into consideration the unique competencies that are really important to that work as a CEO, as well as some board advisory work to make sure there's alignment there. So we have that aspect of our business. Leadership development work is, of course, is also a very big piece. But this outplacement side is also very relevant. And so when organizations are in a situation, whether that's a larger reduction in force because of a strategy change, we've been, working with organizations that have had funding pulled and that they just can't exist without it. And so they've had to shut their doors, those kind of situations, or even when there's executives or individuals that just aren't the right fit for the organization anymore. And just as part of our talent strategy, it's to, we want to transition them out in a really respectful way so that they're still set up for success for wherever they need to go. So that's the other part of what we do. And they all kind of have, kind of a big component of that talent life cycle, if you will. So when we're working with organizations and individuals, we're always trying to, to help them figure out where are they at in that piece, and do they need some of these different components to help, come from a talent perspective that shows people you're really thinking about them at all aspects of that journey they are on with you.
Yeah, and I would think that trust performance index, using that to help guide where
Yes.
you're doing well, where you're not doing well, is probably an important part of that process.
It is. And we really try to we do work with organizations. Much of what's, laid out in the research helps get companies started to where they can absolutely take this and replicate it and measure it. And we can come in and help them set that up and help them pull it through. But it's doable. And it's something that as an executive leadership team, they need to get aligned on first and make sure that they have their own strength and trust amongst each other, and then be able to start to bring that down inside the organization.
Kim, if somebody wants to find out more about, about the company, about Spark Effect, and they want to find out more about it or access the research study, where's the best place for them to go?
So let me give you a few options. So we did set up an opportunity for listeners to come to a landing page that's specifically for your podcast. So it's sparkeffect.com/BLT. So short for the Better Leadership Team. So BLT, they'll be able to download the report, as well as some guides that give them a little bit more tangible ways of taking that data and bringing it into their organization and doing something with it. Of course, I'm also on LinkedIn. So Kim Bohr, find me on LinkedIn. And then we also have a podcast called Courage to Advance. And so love to have listeners come over. It's a business focused podcast as well. Love to have them come over and check out the conversations we're doing there. And so I'll make sure you have those links as well.
Beautiful. We'll put all that in the show notes. Well, Kim, this was great. Love this conversation. I always say, if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. Kim, thanks for helping us get there today.
Thanks for having me, Mike.